Erin O'Toole says that his climate plan will reduce emissions as much as the other parties, but at a lower cost. He touts modeling by Navius Research, the very reputable firm, as proof. Unfortunately, there's a gaping hole in his argument. O'Toole didn't ask Navius to include the CPC's proposed expansion of oil and gas production, the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the country. Why is this important? The data show that as long as oil and gas output is rising, emissions rise too. At best, they plateau for a few years, but they never fall, ever. Oil production is already forecast to expand by almost 20% and natural gas by 8% by 2030. Adding more oil and gas production on top of that increase spells big trouble for the CPC climate plan. I'm going to explain why, but first, a bit of context. There are two ways to think about oil and gas emissions: emissions intensity and total emissions. Emissions intensity is usually expressed as kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per barrel. For example, oil sands emissions intensity fell from 87 to 70 kilograms per CO2e per barrel over the past decade. Industry lobby groups often mislead Canadians by saying oil sands emissions are falling. That's not true. Emissions intensity is falling, but not total emissions, which is the sum of the emissions in all the barrels of oil extracted in a year. When it comes to climate targets, only total emissions count. Canada's total annual emissions are 726 megatons a year, and oil and gas accounts for 193 megatons, or 26%, the highest of any economic sector. The Alberta oil sands alone is 84 megatons, or 11% of the total. Conventional oil production generates 29 megatons, natural gas is 50 megatons, and the rest is pipelines, refineries, and other related activities. Here's another thing you need to know about oil and gas emissions. They're really, really hard to lower. For example, after spending hundreds of millions of dollars over the past decade, oil sands companies have only reduced per barrel emissions by 20%. As one would expect, all that gain was wiped out by rising output. The oil and gas sector looks ready to repeat that performance this decade. Environment and Climate Change Canada forecasts a production increase this decade of 1.4 million barrels a day for oil and 300,000 BOE, barrels of oil equivalent, for gas. According to ECCC modeling, emissions will rise again, though only slightly, to 194 megatons. The point here is that oil and gas emissions will continue the trend of not falling because of rising supply, despite government policies that reduce emissions intensity. No matter how hard industry works to lower emissions, as long as production grows, emissions rise or remain flat. They never, ever fall. Now, let's look at the energy section of the CPC platform. Navius told me in an email that, and I quote, "Regarding oil and gas production, we didn't include any efforts to directly or indirectly alter production." That is, they use the same production forecast for all parties. But what about CPC promises to grow oil and gas production over and above forecast amounts? For example, O'Toole's commitment to build the Northern Gateway pipeline. If built, that's 590,000 barrels a day of diluted bitumen shipped to the West Coast. The upstream emissions alone from that pipeline are estimated by Environment Canada to be 13 to 15 megatons a year. Page 33 of the CPC platform says the party will, and I quote, "make pipelines, plural, not singular, that bring Canadian oil to export markets a priority." So just how many multiples of 13 to 15 megatons a year of emissions or more might be added to Canada's total emissions? Well, we don't know because it wasn't modeled. Here's another example. The CPC wants to implement a federal LNG export strategy. The platform goes on to say, and again, I quote, "Canada is blessed with abundant supplies of clean and affordable natural gas and the clean electricity required to create the cleanest LNG in the world." Well, that's only half true. According to a 2018 study by the Canadian Energy Research Institute, British Columbia produces very clean gas. Alberta is much dirtier and Saskatchewan is atrociously bad. But the situation might be even worse because we really don't know how much methane is emitted from Canadian production. Emissions data is poor because until recently, the measuring equipment was expensive and testing was infrequent. However, in the past few years, better technology has improved the data. The Pembina Institute says the most recent literature shows Canadian methane emissions to be 1.5 to 2 times higher than previously thought. That would put LNG made with Alberta and Saskatchewan gas well over the threshold of 3% methane leakage required to cleanly replace coal in Asian power plants, as the CPC claims would happen. And even if we accept the CPC claim that Canada will make the cleanest LNG in the world, LNG Canada's BC plant, for example, will add 4 to 9 megatons per year to Canada's total emissions. So how much more would be added by more LNG plants and the extra natural gas they would require? Again, we don't know because it wasn't modeled. These are just 2 examples of pro-oil and gas policies in the CPC platform that could significantly increase emissions. Let's talk a moment about the cost of lowering emissions. Back in June, the Big 5 oil sands companies launched a net zero by 25 initiative. Price tag? A cool $75 billion. A few days later, CEOs told reporters they expected taxpayers to pay $50 billion of that. That $50 billion would help decarbonize just 43% of Canadian oil production. What would it cost to decarbonize the rest? What about the cost to decarbonize the additional production caused by CPC policies? We don't know, and apparently neither does the CPC, because they didn't ask Navius to model it. So how credible is the CPC claim about its climate plan? Economist Mark Jackard has answered that question. He used the same model as Navius to assess the credibility of the party's climate plans. He gave the Liberals 8 out of 10, but the Conservatives only 5 out of 10. Here's what he had to say about CPC credibility on climate policy, and I quote, "I rank them, the CPC, substantially lower than the Liberals, however, because they have a credibility challenge. Past federal and provincial Conservative governments have not been sincere about reducing GHG emissions. One hopes the 2021 federal Conservatives are different, but the Canadian voter should be wary." After years of reporting on the oil patch's efforts to lower emissions, I agree with Dr. Jackard. The CPC climate plan has a huge credibility problem. The fact Erin O'Toole didn't have Navius model his platform's oil and gas promises suggests the CPC know it too.